My next question is about the statistics that you're about to publish. Now, we see that you claim that Bitcoin is the cleanest energy consumer sector-wise on the planet. Talk to us about that.
If you look across industry right now, say banking industry, gold industry, steel manufacturing, zinc recycling, throw in a whole bunch of other industries in there as well. The cleanest ones are the ones, in terms of lowest emissions, the ones who are predominantly using electricity. So if you look at the gold sector, for example, it uses a lot of fossil fuel to do the extraction from the ground, a lot of diesel trucks, etc. The banking sector is quite a lot cleaner compared to gold because it's using predominantly electricity. However, that electricity is using a global grid, and globally, most of that grid is powered by fossil fuels. So the banking sector actually is around 60-something percent, I would say about 63% at the moment, powered by fossil fuel. Now, if you compare Bitcoin, Bitcoin is 100% electrified. And this is a really key distinction because a lot of the time people say Bitcoin mining is dirty because it uses fossil fuel and EVs are clean because they use electricity. It's like, hang on a minute. They both use electricity. So either they're both dirty or they're both clean. Let's get that clear right now. So both of them have no indirect, or they're fully electrified, right? So in that sense, there's no direct emissions from either. However, there are indirect emissions because you're using electricity, which in some cases has used fossil fuel in the generation of that electricity. Now you can distinguish how much of each one is powered by fossil fuels. What's unique about Bitcoin is that unlike EVs, unlike the banking sector, unlike every other industry on the planet, it can form specific off-grid power purchase agreements with off-takers for that energy. So people who are generating energy, they can form direct relationships. That's something the banking sector doesn't and can't do. It's something that no other industry can do. EVs certainly don't do that. They're tethered to the grid. And we know from the data that around 28% of Bitcoin mining companies, at least worldwide, have formed these direct off-grid relationships with power providers. Now, who are they providing it with? And why are they going off-grid? Well, they're going off-grid because they can get cheaper power, of course. It's simple economic imperatives. Now, these days, what does cheaper power tend to be? Well, it tends to be renewable. It tends to be sustainable. The cost of generating sustainable, renewable electricity today is significantly cheaper than the equivalent cost of using coal or natural gas in most cases. Not in all, there are some geographic variations, but in most cases. So what that means is these Bitcoin mining companies that are off-grid, 80% of them are using sustainable energy sources. When you add that into the mix, you find that it raises the overall sustainable energy mix of Bitcoin above every other industry sector in the world. So it's now using more than 50% sustainable energy. There's no other global industry in the world that has anywhere close to that. And that's a narrative that hasn't been told. You'll hear things like Bitcoin uses fossil fuels. Well, of course it does. Every industry uses fossil fuels, including the solar industry. So that's just information that is used out of context in order to create a false narrative. If you're looking at this scientifically, though, and you're doing a comparison, you say, what's important is not does it use fossil fuels, but how much is it using? Where is it trending? How does it compare to other industries? And if you look at those statistics, it compares incredibly well. It is the number one user of clean energy as an industry sector in the world right now, and it's trending even more in that direction. That's phenomenal.
It is phenomenal. And so what I want to ask you next, it has to do with a big thesis of yours, which is that once Bitcoin has the ESG check mark next to it, it unlocks trillions worth of capital that can come in and invest. So that is the setup, and we completely agree here. But without getting too much into what it means to have an ESG check mark, let's focus on what you just told us, which is that Bitcoin is actually incredible for the environment. And that is the narrative that we don't have with us. In the mainstream, the narrative is that Bitcoin is bad for the environment, and then proponents of Bitcoin are saying, no, it's actually not bad for the environment. But we need to take it 3 steps further to say it's not that it's not bad, not that it's good, but that it is incredible for the environment. And that because it's incredible for the environment, whatever bureaucratic ESG checkmark you have, whatever framework, Bitcoin should have one of the largest checks next to it because of what is happening in this environment. So for the audience, I want to set that up that it, but as Bitcoin as an investment, yes, there's potential trillions behind an ESG checkmark. And we are excited about that potential, but that is not as relevant as the fact that Bitcoin is incredible for the environment. So, Daniel, I want you to take Bitcoin is incredible for the environment and give us your best rant here. Explain to the world why it's not just that Bitcoin is not bad, but that it is really something powerful, and not just powerful, but so that people understand Daniel has dedicated an enormous portion of his intellectual capacity, career, and future to this very concept of Bitcoin mining off of methane capture. So, as someone who's actually proof is in the pudding and not just talking but walking, tell us how you feel about this idea that Bitcoin can be so powerful for our planet and for humanity itself.
So the first thing I want to say is some context. So I've seen over 200 different climate tech propositions over the last 10, 15 years. And of those, Bitcoin is by far the most fast acting, measurable, and scalable form of climate tech that I've seen. One thing and one advantage that I have coming from a technology investment perspective is that I don't abide by the principle of premature evaluation, which is you look at a technology today and you say, this uses emissions, therefore it's bad. If we had used that as a rubric for evaluating climate tech, we would have banned every single form of climate tech that ever exists. We would have banned wind. We would have banned solar panels. People forget that it wasn't until the early 2000s that the solar industry started to pay off its carbon footprint. It's been around since the 1950s. We gave it a 50-year grace period. Environmentalists in the 90s were debating whether it's good for the environment. And you had the premature evaluators who were saying it's using coal, it's bad. But you had the people who had the ability to zoom out and see trajectory who said, wait a minute, it's trending in the right direction and it could be absolutely incredible. Bitcoin has that same potential that I see in the solar industry, unquestionably. And if you look at how it's trending, if you look at its ability to solve very real problems on the grid, such as when you put more intermittent power on the grid, you can only do that in proportion to your capacity to have very flexible consumers. And Bitcoin is the most flexible consumer of energy that has ever existed, bar none. It can be scaled up and down within a heartbeat and to a precise calibration. We've never had a flexible user like that. And the grid stabilization capacity is so huge that I can't imagine that any nation in the world will be successful in variable renewable energy-based grids and if they don't have very flexible consumers at the same time to handle that intermittency. And there is no one better than Bitcoin mining. That's the grid side. And then you've got this whole other area, which is methane mitigation. What a lot of people don't realize right now is we're not talking about future stuff. This is happening already. We already have, through Crusoe Energy and through a number of the different Bitcoin mining companies who are taking previously flared gas from the oil and gas industry that was, again, contributing emissions because a lot of that flare stack was still going directly into the atmosphere, leaching methane, and they're now taking that and they're putting it into generators, which is lowering emissions. And if you combine that, if you add up the impact of that, Bitcoin's already mitigating 6% of the entire emissions of the Bitcoin network. 6%. That's huge. No one is even close to that. No other industry in the planet can mitigate its emissions to that extent without having to buy offsets. So this is very unique. And that's without even really starting on vented sources of methane. If we start using vented sources of methane, we can go 10 times as fast because using vented methane will mitigate 10 times the emissions that using flared gas emissions will. So Bitcoin has the capability to be the first industry in the world which fully offsets emissions completely without having to use some fiat accounting instrument in order to show on a balance sheet that it's done it by buying someone else's credits. It can do it organically, simply through mitigating more emissions than it's creating. And it's not going to stop there. You think that Bitcoin miners are going to say, hey, job done, we're going to stop? No, of course they're not. They're going to say, hey, there's more cheap power, there's more landfills, there's more pollution, there's more wasted energy that we can monetize. Let's continue this alchemy. Let's keep on turning this waste into digital gold. And the more this scales, you'll see in the future, and I'm staking my professional reputation on this, that you're going to see a network which is mitigating vastly more emissions than it is creating this decade. And it doesn't take a lot to do that. As I said, 35 landfills, you're emission neutral. 70 landfills, you're now mitigating twice the emissions you're creating. It's a phenomenal potential. And the incredible thing is that if it weren't for Bitcoin mining, we don't have a number of other good options. It's like, what else are we going to do with that landfill gas? What else are we going to do with that methane?